Shalom everyone, and welcome to the channel. If you enjoy the content that you see today, leave a like down below, and please consider subscribing to the channel and become part of our growing community. With all that out of the way, enjoy the video. Shalom. Shalom, and welcome back to the channel. Today's teaching is going to be centered around Hannukah, specifically the historical events of what took place and how it pertains to today and how we're living, and then also prophetically what it points to in the future and what will occur just before Yeshua returns. Hannukah takes place in December or early November, or even as late as early January every year. This year, as the time of this recording, 2024, it actually falls on December 25th, ironically. So while the world is celebrating Christmas, many of the believers in Yeshua the Messiah and the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are observing Hannukah. So there's a distinct separation between both of those observances. And I think the story of Hannukah, once we learn and understand what happened, we can see how it relates to today and the different customs and traditions that people partake of during this time of the year, and how it's separate from how God's people saw things, what they observed, how they celebrated, and the things that they partook of in that time. And then, as I said, as it relates to today. The Hebrew word Hannukah actually means dedication, specifically the dedication of the altar or the temple of God. The holy temple just couldn't be used, or the altar just couldn't be used when it was built. It had to be dedicated, and therefore we get the word Hannukah. We see that in the book of John, I believe it's in chapter 10, where Yeshua was at the temple during the Feast of Lights. Some translations use the Feast of Lights or the Festival of Lights, or some translations say the festival of dedication, which is where we get the word Hannukah. So there was a rededication of the temple, a rededication of the altar that was going on. The actual events, the historical event of Hannukah, takes place between the book of Malachi and the New Testament, or the Brit Hadashah. Brit Hadashah is the Hebrew way of saying the New Testament. So between the last revelation that God gave to his prophet Malachi and when the New Testament, or the Brit Hadashah, was written, there's where the event of Hannukah takes place. It's roughly between 300 to 400 years in between that time period. And in that time period, there was what we would call a Persian-Greek war. Medo-Persia is located in what we would currently call Iran. So if you know where Israel is located, it would be to the east of Israel. Iran is to the east of Israel, and there's where Medo-Persia was located. And as I stated, Darius III was the king and the leader of Medo-Persia. So there was this conflict with Greece during this time, and more specifically Macedonia, which is the northern part of Greece. It's located just north of Greece, kind of to where Turkey is also as well. And Darius wanted to move to the north, to the south, and to the west. He started conquering that way, the north, the south, and the west, out of what we would call, again, Iran, Medo-Persia. He was conquering in that location. However, a man by the name of Philip of Macedonian, which is in Greece, wanted to defeat Darius III and his Persian Empire. They had been sweeping over many lands, the Persian Empire was, and Philip wanted to confront Darius III and defeat this army. But it so happened that Philip the Macedonian dies during this time period. And in his place, a man arises to power, His name was Alexander. We know him from a historical context as Alexander the Great. And he came to power at a very, very young age. He was roughly around 20 years old when he became the leader of the Grecian Empire. So he moves through Turkey and he clashes with Darius III at the Battle of Issus. The Issus is north of Israel, northeast of Israel, and west of Iran or Medo-Persia. I'm going to be putting up some maps on this video so you can kind of get a better idea of Alexander the Great's in the Grecians' territory that they were taking during this time period. Alexander takes power during this time period, and he clashes with Darius III at the Battle of Issus. Now, this was a narrow strip of land. You had the Mediterranean on one side, the Mediterranean Sea on one side, and then you had mountains on the other side. So it was a very narrow strip of land. And although Darius III had an advantage, a distinct advantage, by having a greater army, Alexander actually won that battle. Darius III was not able to get the majority of his army in that battle because of the narrow strip of land. But as history recalls, Alexander the Great had very great military tactics and light armor military tactics, and he was able to easily win that war against Darius III in the Battle of Issus. Now, after Alexander won that war or that battle in Issus, Darius III and his army retreated back to their area, back to their homeland after their defeat. But they had received news of the victory that Greece had in Egypt, because after that Battle of Issus, Alexander the Great and the Greeks went south through Israel and they went into Egypt and they conquered that land as well. And this is when Darius III and his army, they learned of this defeat of Egypt and Greece conquering these lands, and they were going to make their way back up north. However, if you know the geographic topography and the layout of the land, Israel is located by the coast, by the Mediterranean Sea. Anything that was south of Israel, southeast of Israel, in the peninsula area and going down south, it was just desert. It was desolate land. But north of that, or in the Israel area, it was fertile. And Darius III knew that as the Greeks were coming back north, they conquered all the way down. They went through Israel. There was no battle, by the way, in Israel. He just went through Israel and he conquered Egypt. And Darius III knew that Alexander the Great was coming back up north. And he had to go through Israel, or that portion, because Alexander the Great had tens of thousands of men in his army. And in order to feed his army and to have them drink, water and be nourished, they could not go further south. There was nothing there. It was desolate. So Darius III knew this. And in the battle that was going to be ensuing, he set up his army knowing that Alexander the Great and his army were going to be coming towards them. So he met the army, Alexander's army, at the Battle of Gaugamela. This was a very intense battle between these two nations. As a matter of fact, it's written, there's historical accounts that the Persian army used elephants during this battle. It was that epic, that great. But eventually Alexander won, and he emerged victorious during this battle, largely due to his military tactics that he had ensued upon the Persian army. He then moves on to Babylon, then to Susa, all the way to what we would call the current borders of India. He had conquered a large portion of the known world. And history, if you took any history classes, you'll know that this is known from Alexander the Great and his Greek army, that they conquered a large portion of the Greek known world. And then he comes back in a full sweep, and he's coming back to Babylon, and Alexander the Great dies in Babylon. about 10 years after he started his campaign, after he became in power. Just 10 short years later, he dies. So it was a very swift conquering of the known world. But after his death, Alexander didn't have an heir. So what ended up happening is his territory, the Grecian territory, got divided upon his 4 major generals. Ptolemy took Egypt. Seleucid took ancient Persia, Syria, and Turkey, around that area. Lysimachus took Macedonia, and Cassander took Athens. But in relations to Hannukah, we're going to specifically hone in on Ptolemy and the Seleucids, because the Seleucids were just north of Israel, and Ptolemy was the Egyptian part was south of Israel. And you had Israel stuck in between these two empires, between these two factions of the Greek Empire, but they were divided up. And as I mentioned, Israel was in the middle. They were kind of like a land bridge. And it was vitally important because, as I mentioned before, they had water, they had food. To the south was desolate. So Israel was a very important piece of land. And so there was a tug of war going on between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. Years later, in the midst of this conflict, a man arises to power within the Greek Empire by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes. He would go on to refer to himself as Antiochus Theos Epiphanes, which means God is manifest, or the manifestation of God himself. Antiochus was a huge egomaniac. He was very tyrannical. Many of his detractors referred to him as a madman. I mean, this man was horrible, and he wanted to consolidate his kingdom again, the Alexandrian kingdom that had been ruling before. He wanted to consolidate it and bring it back together, and he wanted to be the head of it. And so all the territories that he was over, he started to incorporate them into the Greek culture, the philosophy, and the Greek gods with their customs and religions. This was known as Hellenization, and Israel was part of it. Israel was no exception. This came to Israel, and some of the Jews rejected this Hellenization, and some of them accepted it. There was a high priest at the time by the name of Onias, and he was opposed to the Hellenization of Israel, to all the customs, the holidays, the worship of the Greek gods, and all the philosophy that came along with the Greeks. He rejected it, but his brother was in favor of it. And so there was this conflict within the priesthood. There were some priests that were against Hellenization, and there were some priests that were for the Hellenization. And the reason they were for the Hellenization is because they wanted to avoid the complete massacre that Antiochus Epiphanes would bring upon the people. So they were like, hey, we'll go along with it. But as I mentioned, Onias, which was the high priest at the time, rejected it. But eventually, many of the Jews succumbed to the Hellenization, the Greek culture. They just accepted it after many, many years. Now, Antiochus Epiphanes wanted to expand even further to the south, so he went into Egypt during this time period. Again, it had been conquered before, but it had been split up after Alexander's death. So Antiochus, in an effort to consolidate this whole kingdom, from the 4 generals, he went down to the south to reallocate, to regather the southern part of his kingdom. And so when he went down south, Rome heard about this, and they did not like the idea of Antiochus going and expanding his kingdom, because Rome was expanding. So they sent a representative from Rome to Egypt to talk to Antiochus, and they basically threatened him. They said, if you continue doing what you're doing here in Egypt and abroad, that you will have war with Rome. And when they threatened him, they gave him this ultimatum. Antiochus went with his tail between his legs and went back up north out of Egypt. He heard that there were still infighting between the Jews. He heard that there were still some Jews that were rejecting the Hellenization of his culture and some that were accepting it. And then there was a rumor going around also that Antiochus Epiphanes had died. And again, this he was going already humiliated going back. But hearing this news also made him angry. And as he makes his way back through Israel, he hears all of these things going on, and he orders his generals to attack Jerusalem, to have no mercy on any of the people. And thousands of people, Jews, were killed. They died. This was absolutely devastating to Israel. Antiochus did not let anybody who wanted to observe Torah, he did not let them. He forbade it from happening. Eventually, he made his way to the Holy Temple, or the Beit HaMikdash. It's the Holy Temple in Hebrew, putting an end to the daily offerings or the daily sacrifices. He put a cease to that. He went on to kill a pig on the altar and sprinkled the blood of the pig on all the scrolls all throughout the temple. It was a complete desecration of the temple. Now you have to realize how the Jewish mindset thought about swine's flesh, thought about pig. The Torah very clearly says that the pig or the swine is an abomination to God. It's an unclean animal. They're not only not to consume it, but they're to stay away from it. So bringing a pig on the altar, slaughtering it on the altar as a sacrifice or as an offering to God, was mocking and just completely desecrating their way of life and the temple. I mean, this is the place where Adonai would dwell with his people, in the Holy of Holies, in the Holy Temple. And here we have a man, this tyrannical madman, that was completely desecrating the temple of God's people, slaughtering a pig and putting blood all over the place, the blood of the pig all over the place on the scrolls. He then goes on to put a statue of his god, Zeus, in the temple. He actually takes the head of Zeus off of the statue, and he puts on the statue of his own head, of Antiochus's head, on top of the statue, pretty much proclaiming that he is God. And he puts this in the temple of God. Now, in the midst of Antiochus doing all these horrific things, there were many Jews that resisted. History records a story of a man by the name of Eleazar. He was one of the scribes, a man in his older age. He was being forced to open his mouth and to eat swine's flesh. But he welcomed death with honor rather than his life being polluted. Some men tried to persuade Eleazar. They were telling him to go get some clean meat and pretend that he's eating swine's flesh, but replace that swine's flesh with clean meat and eat it in order to save his life so he wouldn't experience death. But Eleazar, knowing that there was a lot of young people that were watching him, and he was of elderly age and had known and observed Torah his whole life, he did not want to set a bad example to the young people so they could see somebody that had relinquished Torah, that had given in to this Hellenization and abandoned the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He would rather have gone to his death. By giving his life now, he would show himself worthy of his old age and dedication to God. Then there's the story of Hannah and her 7 sons. They were all threatened with death if they did not consume swine's flesh as well. It just seemed like Antiochus had this obsession with swine's flesh because he knew full well that it was an abomination to the Jews. And as I stated before, in his rage of being rejected in Egypt, he took it out on the Jews. And he took that one thing that he knew that was an abomination to them and forced them, Eleazar and now Hannah and her seven sons to consume swine's flesh. One of her sons is quoted as saying, "What do you intend to ask and learn from us? We are ready to die rather than transgress the laws of our fathers." So enraged, Antiochus ordered him not only to be scalped, which scalp basically means to take the skin off the top of your head with your hair, exposing your skull. So he was scalped completely. They chopped off his hands at his wrist, and they chopped off his feet at his ankles. And still being helpless, but still breathing, Antiochus ordered his generals to heat up a cauldron, and Hannah's son was thrown into the cauldron where he died. What made this even worse is that he had Hannah, which is the mother, and all the brothers watch as he was doing this to the son. His son was that first son stood up and rejected, obviously, and would rather go to his death, and to make an example out of him. That is what Antiochus did to her son. He then went on to do the same thing one by one to each of her sons, culminating in also killing the mother at the end. And in one of the villages, Antiochus ordered his generals to set up an altar for a swine to be sacrificed. And he demanded all the people in that village to partake of it. Mattathias refused. He was one of the priests. He refused, and he revolted against that order that Antiochus had given. And this is what began what we know as the Maccabean Revolt. Mattathias' oldest son, Judah, known as Judah the Hammer, led the revolt along with his brothers for the next 3 years against Antiochus and his army. It was like a guerrilla type warfare because they didn't have an army. So Judah Maccabee had to recruit the very few Jews that were rejecting the Hellenization of what was going on, the incorporation of the Greek culture and the gods and the customs and the worship of Zeus. The very few that were rejecting that, he gathered them and formed a small army. Well, what ended up happening is the revolt ended up victorious against Antiochus and his grand army, and he pushed them out of Israel. And they ended up winning that war, and they reclaimed back the temple. So, but when they went back to the temple, they found it again completely desecrated, weeds growing up everywhere, the Torah, the scrolls being desecrated, all the vessels being desecrated, everything. And so they had to clean everything up and rededicate the temple, rededicate the altar. And this is where we get the word Hannukah for this celebration. The scripture is saying that in order for the temple to be ready to be used, they have to rededicate it. And this rededication, this dedication of the altar and the temple takes 7 days. And we read that in 2 Chronicles chapter 7, verses 9 through 10. On the 8th day, they held a solemn assembly, having observed the dedication of the altar for 7 days and the festival for 7 days. Then on the 23rd day of the 7th month, he sent the people away to their tents, full of joy and glad of heart for all the goodness Adonai had shown to David, to Solomon, and to Israel, his people. So the altar was dedicated in 7 days, and on the 8th day they had a solemn assembly, and the altar was ready to be used on the 8th day and afterwards, after it was dedicated. This is why we see the 9-candlestick menorah. You have 8 candlesticks and then one in the middle, which makes 9. The middle one is used to light the other ones. So really you have 8 significant candlesticks. So how does this relate to prophecy? Well, in Daniel chapter 8, verses 1 through 12, we see these historical events come to fruition after Daniel had already prophesied. So we read in verse 1, After that first vision, it was in the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar that another vision appeared to me, Daniel. I looked into the vision, and as I looked, I found myself in Shushan, the capital in the province of Elam. I looked into the vision, and as I was by the Ulai Canal, I looked up, and as I watched, there in front of the stream stood a ram with 2 horns. The horns were long, but one was longer than the other, and the longer one came up later than the other. I saw the ram pushing to the west, north, and south, and no animals could stand up against it, nor was there anyone that could rescue from its power. So it did as it pleased and became very strong. The ram is the Persian Empire that we spoke about earlier. As you recall, the king from Medo-Persia, which was Darius III, came out and conquered to the west, to the north, and to the south. This is exactly what Daniel is prophesying here. He goes on to say, I was beginning to understand when a male goat came from the west, passing over the whole earth without touching the ground. The goat had a prominent horn between its eyes. The goat that we see here is Greece, or Yavan in Hebrew. And the horn that comes from this goat is Alexander the Great. Goes on to say, it approached the ram with 2 horns, which I had seen standing in front of the river, and it charged it with savage force. As you recall, Alexander the Great came from the north and attacked or retaliated against the ram, or Persia, which is exactly what we see here that Daniel was prophesying. I watched as it advanced on the ram, filled with rage against it, and struck the ram, breaking its 2 horns. The ram was powerless to stand against it. It threw the ram to the ground and trampled it down, and there was no one that could rescue it from the goat's power. Antiochus Epiphanes was a foreshadow of the coming anti-Messiah, or the coming Antichrist that we read about in the New Testament, or the Brit Hadashah. There will be many who will fall away from the ways of God during this time. People that are going to reject the Torah, reject God and his ways, and be assimilated into the world. This has been going on already for thousands of years, ever since the time of Jesus, ever since the time of Yeshua, when he was here walking the earth. Gradually, we have seen an apostasy of the people of God, their love growing cold and going away from the things of God, going away from the Torah and following the ways of the nations, its customs and its traditions. So what happened back then, during the original Hannukah, when Antiochus Epiphanes had tried to Hellenize God's people, bring them into the culture and philosophy and customs and religions and gods of his nation, we see the same thing going on today in the religious holidays that most people will follow. And you could throw Christmas into that, because a lot of the traditions that come from the celebration of holidays such as Christmas are not rooted whatsoever in biblical matters or the Torah or the Bible. They are rooted in pagan philosophies, in Gentile nation traditions. And so that's where that comes from. And just as back then there was a separation of God's people that wanted to continue with the Torah, to wanted to continue, even went to death. Went to death if they didn't keep the Torah. They would rather go to their death than to abandon the Torah. And then there were others back then that gladly just rejected God's ways and got Hellenized and went to the ways of the world. It's no different today. We see the split within God's people also as well. Some wanting to hold on to the traditions of their fathers through the Torah and God's ways, and others that are wanting to hold on to the traditions of the world. And we see that happening. And during the time of the anti-Messiah, the Antichrist, the anti-Messiah will reestablish this covenant that God made with his people. And he's going to allow the daily sacrifices, or the daily offerings, which is a better translation of it. He's going to allow the morning and evening offerings to be reinstituted again. He'll make some may call it a peace treaty, but it's really a strengthening of the covenant to allow Israel to resume these holy temple events that'll be taking place. But then halfway through that covenantal treaty, the anti-Messiah, this tyrannical maniac, is going to break that covenant, and he will put an end to those offerings, or what Yeshua refers to as the abomination of desolation. Yeshua speaks about the story of Hannukah that Daniel actually wrote about in the book of Matthew, specifically Matthew chapter 24, verses 12 through 15. So if we just think that Hannukah has no significance for God's people, you're mistaken, because even Yeshua, Jesus, refers to the events of Hannukah as something that's going to take place in the future. So it would serve us well. It would behoove us to learn about what happened back then so that we don't fall away from the things of God, so that we can have the heart of someone like Eleazar or Hannah and her 7 sons, to have a strong enough heart to be willing to go to our death than to abandon God's ways. In Matthew 24, it reads, "And many people's love will grow cold because of increased distance from Torah. But whoever holds out to the end will be delivered. And this good news or gospel about the kingdom will be announced throughout the whole world as a witness to all the nations, or to all the Goyim. It is then that the end will come. So when you see the abomination that causes desolation or devastation spoken about through the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand the allusion." So these are the words of Yeshua, the Messiah of Israel, our Savior. He is warning us that the events that took place in Hannukah, during the time of Hannukah, when Antiochus Epiphanes desecrated the temple and caused an abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, which we just read in Daniel 8, and it goes on in many other places in the book of Daniel. Yeshua is telling us in the future this event will repeat itself, so he's trying to warn us so we can be prepared. Paul also speaks about this event and how it relates to Hannukah. "Don't let anyone deceive you in any way, for the day will not come until after the apostasy has come, and the man who separates himself from Torah has been revealed, the one destined for doom. He will oppose himself to everything that people call a god or make an object of worship. He will put himself above them all, so that he will sit in the temple of God and proclaim that he himself is God." If you've been following along, you will know that Antiochus Epiphanes did this exact thing that Paul or Shaul is referring to. And again, he is actually referring to what happened, what Daniel had prophesied. So this Antichrist, this anti-Messiah that will come in the near future, I believe it's in the near future, will exhibit the same behaviors and do the same things that Antiochus Epiphanes, which, remember, would refer to himself as God manifest pretty much in the flesh, which is what the Antichrist is going to proclaim to be when he sits in the temple, as Paul wrote about here in 2 Thessalonians. So Hannukah is extremely important for the people of God to observe. It is not, and I want to emphasize this, Hannukah is not a Moedim or an appointed time that God has prescribed for his people. God has given us 7 Moedim, 7 appointed times, if you will, for us to be observing throughout the year. And all of them point to Yeshua. The first 3 of these are Passover, first fruits, and unleavened bread. And they point to what happened with Yeshua when he first came. Passover, when he died and shed his blood unleavened bread when he was put in the grave without sin, and then first fruits when he arose on the third day as a resurrection, and the first fruits of all those who will be resurrected in the future. He fulfilled Shavuot, which is the fourth Moedim, the fourth appointed time, when the Holy Spirit, or the Ruach HaKodesh, came down to dwell with his people. And then the last three, which is the Feast of Trumpets, or the Day of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles. He will fulfill those when he returns as well. And that's a completely different teaching than this. I want to stay specific to Hannukah in this teaching. But all that in saying is that God has already given us appointed times for us to remember. Hannukah is not one of those appointed times that we're commanded to keep. However, it's important because it is a historical event that took place in Israel and points us to the future coming anti-Messiah, Antichrist. And Yeshua refers to this in the book of Matthew. And if he deems it worthy and important enough to warn us by commanding us to remember this, of what happened with the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel, then we should take heed to that. So I hope that this teaching has blessed you. I hope this opens your eyes to Hannukah and what it really means to us today, for those that walk with God, the people of God, and how it pertains to us in the future coming events. If you found this teaching a blessing, please consider subscribing, liking the video, sharing it with as many people as possible. I would really appreciate it. Shalom.